It's kind of a difficult weekend we all had, but and it is difficult to weave when um, things are so turmoil and seeing destruction and sadness and grief and anyway, it's hard. It's hard to stay on track with our art, and but we have to move forward and be as normal as we can in a very not normal world right now. So I'm going to be weaving. Um, it's sometimes you don't want to weave sadness into your work. So if you do feel like your heart is hurting and your thoughts are sad, then times like this, you just can't do your work. Um, your heart isn't following your hands. So I'm going to I will weave and demonstrate. I think that I'll look for a story to tell you. I'll look for a story to narrate. So I'm continuing to bring in the braids, and I'm going to be getting to a side where there's other interlocking joins for the side borders, and so we might reach that area today. We might not. I don't know how long I'll get to weave uninterrupted today. So thank you for joining me, and I hope for you to have a peaceful heart. I'm going to read a story from the Swanton Haida text Masset dialect. It's story 30 and the origins of carved house posts. So this is my I'm part of the clan that has this story in their family. It's on page 457, The Origins of Carved House Posts. Many people lived in the town of Gitankaitlana. The east wind blew so strongly that some of the houses were blown down, so they did not care to live there. They went away, and they came to live at Delcatla. Then there was no salt water there. It was all covered with grass. Then they dug the town chief's household. They finished his first, and all of the people lived in his house. But afterwards they built houses on either side of him. All of these houses were completed. Then all began to live in their own. One autumn, after that, they went to Rosespit to get food in two big canoes. Very many people were in the canoes. They went for berries. Then one woman, who was not paddling, looked into the water. It was very calm, and it was bright sunshine. Then the one who looked into the sea saw something carved at the bottom. It was carved with figures of human beings, and the lower part was carved into the representation of a killer whale. And the human beings stood upon the killer whale. They remained a long time above it. They memorized it, and after they had memorized it, they went away. And when they came over to Luskins, they described it. Some of them said, "We will make the chief's house posts like it." and some of them were afraid. And after they were through picking berries, they started off, and they arrived at the town. Then they told those who had stayed at home about it. They were going to imitate it for the chief when they again built a house for him. And some of them were afraid and did not want to do it. Still they made the representations, and they completed them. There were 2. Then they began to paint them. Then they raised them on something. At that time this land moved. The ocean people were angry on account of it. Then a flood came, and after they had fastened their canoes together, they put the posts upon them. They liked them too much to leave them behind. When the water got far up, the side of a small mountain, they put one of them upon that, and they put one into the sea. Then they wept bitterly. Then they put weasel skins into their ears as earrings. They also put them into the ears of their wives and children. Then they sang. They sang crying songs. They sang for themselves because they thought this would not again dry up. At that time they sang the following crying song. The supernatural beings were the ones who made the flood come. The supernatural beings were the ones who made the flood come. Made the flood come. At that time the sea began to move. The canoes began to sink. And after the canoes had sunk, they, the people, floated upon the ocean. Now they became birds. For that purpose the canoes sank under the sea. The ocean people were the ones who caused it. But after that the tide began to fall, and now they are birds. Part of these birds are called earring wearers. The earring wearers were once people, and they sang that the house post is now upon Ga'o. Ga'o was the name of the mountain that they had all been upon. People used to see it there when they went up to eat medicine. Moss grows upon it. Those who were going to be chiefs kicked off the moss from it. When one saw it, he became rich. Near it stands a very big devil's club, and the chief's household still forms a hole in the sea. When the tide is low, it is still seen, and they also used to pray to the house post to become wealthy. Those who prayed did become wealthy. So that story is from our family story, and it talks about the first house posts, and the people used to live further up into the inlet. Our people used to live near, closer to the Iron River. And in the story, it talks about how the wind blew our houses down up there. So they moved further towards the mouth of the inlet. And my grandmother has stories that she told us about how her people would go to the mouth of the inlet where Masset now stands, and that would be a food gathering place for our clan. So we were one of the first people to be there at the area of Masset to gather food there. And so when we moved, there was the one chief, and we were in one house, and then there were so many people that they built other houses left and right of the central house. And then the flood came, and they valued the posts so much that they took the the posts up on their canoes when the water started lifting and went so far up as the top of this mountain gale. So they figured that it was the powerful ocean that had caused this flood. And so they took and gave the ocean one of the posts, and then the other one they stood up on top of that mountain. So the story goes that if you go up to find that post and see that post, that it'll bring you luck. And a lot of the early chiefs would pilgrimage up to the top there when the post was there, and they would kick the moss off. But that would also give them luck within their chieftainship. And so I also want to say that this place that that they talk about, that there's that hole that that the post stood at, and that hole still exists, and out of that hole comes fresh water, and you can see it at low tide. And so real close to where I live right now, that hole still, I can at low tide go and see that hole and see the fresh water coming up out of that hole. So this is an ancient story about an ancient time, but what's very unique about this story is that what they speak about, you can still see today. So that's a pretty special story in our family. And other people who have talked about that story and retold that story also add that in the canoes that we took the posts up, we also had dogs. Like the lower people, the Haidas also used the dogs for some of the wool that they wove, and so those weavers had dogs in their canoes. And when the bears were floundering around in the water trying to get a hold of logs, and they would come upon the canoes of these people and try to get into the canoes, and many of them were tipped over by these bears, and but the weavers' canoes were not tipped over because they had their dogs that would scare away the bears, that so that they wouldn't touch our canoes, the weavers' canoes. Anyway, that's I really like that story. There is another story right next to it on story 31 that talks about the artisans, that a man and his grandmother were out, and the man would go into the woods and down a cedar to carve a canoe. And so every day he passed this trench around a skunk cabbage, and that skunk cabbage trench started having salmon in it. And so every day he brought salmon to his grandmother. But then the grandmother one day went clam digging, and when she came back, the salmon was all gone that her grandson had given her. And the grandson came home too and said, well, where did the salmon go? And they said that they didn't know. He didn't know where the salmon went. So they decided that they would hide themselves in a corner and put a mat over themselves, and they would find out who was taking their salmon. So I'm going to start reading into that story. Okay, so, and he said to his grandmother, hide yourself in a corner. I too will sit there. And he also hung a mat in front of himself. His grandmother hid herself in a corner, and he put a great many arrows and his bow near himself. He put wood into the fire. Then evening came, and he sat behind the mat. And while he sat there, a person entered through the doorway. He had a big stomach, his legs were small, his fingers, too, were slender. And when he got into the house, he took the salmon, and he began to eat. Then he, the boy, took his bow and began to shoot at him. And he, the person, did not mind them, the arrows. He ate the salmon, he ate it, bones and all, and while he ate, the boy shot all of the arrows into his stomach. After he had consumed the salmon, he went away, and the child and his grandmother went to bed. They did not know what it was. And day came. Then the boy went out, and he went in a certain direction. And when he got a little way from where he lived, towards a mountain, he came upon one of his arrows, and he did not touch it. And he came upon another, and he did not touch them. And he came near the mountain, and he found another arrow, and he found them all. After he had found all, he went to a big town. The fronts of all of the houses were painted. This was the Artisans' town. They took him into the chief's house in the middle, and the one with the big stomach, whom he had shot, lay in the rear of the house. And then he said, "Have the chief sit down here." This was the Artisans' town. The chief said to him, "Why did you shoot one of my servants?" And then he said, "My friends abandoned me along with my grandmother. Then a skunk cabbage began to help me by giving me salmon. I shot him because he ate my grandmother's salmon." Then he said to him, "Skunk cabbage, this one that you shot was skunk cabbage. He helped you," said he. And he was there 10 days. At that time, they told him to learn the paintings on the front of their houses. So he looked at them. He, the chief, said to him, "They will tell you about a medicine." Then a certain one sat in the lower part of the house. And when the boy was about to go out, he sat near him and told him about the from death restoring medicine. When the man got through telling him, the boy started off. Then he came to where his grandmother lived, and he did not see her house there. Her house was decayed and had fallen upon her. Then he took the pieces of cedar bark away, and his grandmother's bones lay there, and he began to gather her bones together. He had been 10 winters in the town of the Artisans, and he thought it was 10 days. And while he was there, his grandmother died. Then he cleared a place on the ground and placed his grandmother's bones there all together. Afterwards he spread a mat over them, and he spit the medicine over it. And then he went over to the other side and again spit up over her. And after that he stood at her head and spit 2 drops upon her forehead. Then his grandmother came to life. And when his grandmother arose, she was glad to see him. Then his grandmother said to him, "Why were you gone so long, grandson?" "I went along finding the arrows I shot into Big Stomach until I came to a big town. The fronts of all the houses were painted. This was the Artisans' town," he said to his grandmother. Then his grandmother said to him, "It is well, child. Your uncles shall also have their houses like that, after you have told them." He was a man of the Gitano. Therefore the fronts of those people's houses are painted. The chief's name was Tsisi. The Gitano is a name for a Simpsian clan. So, and they talk about being close to the Skeena River. So these stories may have come through them. Okay, so then he again built a house, and he made it large. He asked his grandmother, "Where is my bow?" And it was under his grandmother's head, and she gave it to him. And then he went for roots and put a string to it. And then when he had finished, he made 2 arrows. And then an eagle always screamed on that point, and it flew straight seaward. There was nothing to eat. And his grandmother said to him, "Child, shoot small birds for us to eat." And when he went out to the forest, he came to a grouse, and he shot and killed it. He did that many times, and he got many. He pulled off young cedar limbs, tied the necks of the birds together with them, and put them on his back. And when he came home, he gave them to his grandmother. And he said to his grandmother, "Do not pluck the feathers off. Take the skins off." Then his grandmother took the skins off and dried them, and they ate this meat. That The day after they had steamed it, he went out again, and he came to a grouse, and he shot it. Also, he made a handle for that and carried it home, slung at his side. And again he shot many birds, and again he tied their necks together. And again the grandmother, skinned them and dried the skins, and they slept. All that time the eagle sat there and kept calling, and he said to his grandmother, "Grandmother, let me put this grouse below the eagle." "All right, child, give it food," she said to her grandson, and he took it thither. After he had left it there, he went away, and he entered the house. It was evening. Next day he went to the woods to look for birds, but then he got only a few. That time he did not see a grouse. After he had shot them and come back, he gave them to his grandmother, and his grandmother took the skins off and dried them. They steamed the meat, and they ate. Next day he went up to the woods again, and he did not see any small birds. He thought he would see some by and by, and he came home without them. And the meat was gone. But then he told his grandmother to sew these skins together. He told her to make blankets of them. Next day he went to the woods, and he again could not find anything. Then the eagle called from far off, and at that time his grandmother said to him, "Say, child, go to where the eagle is calling." And he went thither. And when he came under it, part of the tail of a spring salmon lay there. He took this away, and he started off with it, and he took it to his grandmother. He said to her, "A spring salmon's tail lay beneath it," and they cut it up and steamed it, and they ate it. Next day when it called, he started out again, but at that time a whole one lay there, and he took it away, and he gave it to his grandmother, and he cut it up open and hung it up, and they ate the backbone, tail, and head. So they continued to feed the eagle, and the eagle continued to give them the food. So very early next morning, the eagle called there again, but this time it was a whole whale, and he kicked it down into the water, and he towed it in, and they got 10 black whales. At that time he remembered what the artisan had said to him, and he said to his grandmother, "The chief of the artisans told me, if there was a slight noise in the house at night, not to look up." Thus he spoke to his grandmother, and when evening came, they went to bed. And in the night their house shook, and they did not look up. And in the morning their house front was painted. The artisans had done it. Then he constructed a big platform over the beach on which to lounge, and this was finished. And he wore the bird skins one over another. His grandmother sewed them, and he sat upon the platform. He also gave one blanket to his grandmother. So the story goes on, but I like that story because it talks about the bird skin blankets that we must have used very early in our culture. The feather blankets of birds were important garments for our people, and I like how they say that he wore 2 of them. So thank you very much.